So let's talk about power. Let's try to define it. How do we define it? Well, it completely depends on how we want to use it, right? If you're a manager or a leader, power means one thing. If you're an economist or a psychologist or a sociologist, it's going to be something else. In fact, power is one of the most defined concepts in the social sciences. So it's used across, from political philosophy to anthropology, economics, psychology. It's just, if you Google what is power, you're going to get hundreds of thousands of definitions. And what's even more confusing is that when it comes to defining power, some people define it as a thing, like a noun, right? Power's status, or power's wealth, or power is physical might or strength. Other people are going to define it as a behavior, right? They're going to say, well, power is your ability to persuade people, or to impact people, or to coerce, or to force people to do something, or to change minds. And then, of course, there's a whole other set of definitions of power, like the classic French and Raven definition, which talk about sources. Power is defined in terms of where it comes from. So there's legitimate power, or, which is authority power based in the position that you're in or the role that you're in. Or there's expert power based on your knowledge or your expertise in something. There's informal powers, which is, let's say, your degree of belonging. And so then there's also people who define it in a more, in terms of better or worse uses of power. So a lot of people define power over, which is kind of a bad kind of power, which is domination or oppression, versus power to or power with, which is an enabling, empowering kind of power. So you can see defining power is really problematic. There's not just one way to define it. For my purposes, I define power as your ability to impact others and the environment with the resources you have at your disposal. And that's very similar to Dr. Keltner's definition of power. Dr. Keltner is a professor of psychology at the University of California at Berkeley and the author of a really good book on power called The Power Paradox. And Keltner defines power as someone's capacity to alter another person's condition or state of mind by providing or withholding resources such as food, money, knowledge, affection, or administering punishment such as physical harm, job termination, or even social ostracism. So I want to break this down because this definition is really important. It highlights a few critical things about power that's important for our purposes. One, power is a resource. And what does that mean? What's a resource? Well, it means it's something of value to someone else. And that's important. It has to be of value to somebody else. So if I try to influence you to do something by offering you a box of oranges, let's say, and you happen to have an orange tree in your backyard, well, that's not a resource that's going to move you to do anything, right? It's not of value to you. So in a way, power is a lot like a currency. It works with some people in some situations, but not across every border or across every context. Right? So that brings us to the second thing, which is power depends on context. And the value of a resource depends entirely on context. So let's say you're at work and you're in a meeting and you're going to try to convince everybody or persuade everybody to follow you by speaking about your knowledge. You're a subject matter expert on that particular topic. Well, that resource, your knowledge, definitely works in that context, right? Your subject matter expertise is going to work there. But if you do the same thing in your intimate or personal relationships, or you do the same thing with people in an area where you don't have expertise, that's not going to work. So certain powers relate to certain contexts and not others, right? And we see this all the time. So, for example, I want to talk about a little piece of power that we use at work all the time, which is the CC button on an email. And this is something that we that's used all the time. And it's a very effective use of power in a certain context. What you'll see here is that it means that power is not just one thing, but it's many, many things. It's information, it's peer pressure, it's knowledge, it's seniority, it's affection, that there's many different kinds of power, and they work in different types of contexts. They don't all work in the same in all contexts. And this is important because when we talk about power, we talk about it in a very binary way. We say things like, well, I've got power, I don't have power, or this person has power, or they don't have power, as if it's kind of black or white, as if you can have power or not have power, when in truth, there's so many different kinds of powers, and we all have some kind of power. And this is really one of the key things that when we talk about power intelligence, we have to really force ourselves to understand, is that power really should be a plural. I don't know why it's a singular noun in English. It really should be a plural noun. We really have powers, not just power, right? And not only that, there's many different kinds, and they change and they shift all the time according to context. And so this is the very final element of this definition of power, is that it's dynamic. It changes, it shifts from moment to moment, from context to context. So some powers work at home really well, or they work with your friends, but they won't work at work. What you use at work to be influential or to make an impact is not going to work in your personal relationships. And so really having to understand all the different kinds of powers you have, where they work, where they don't work, how to use them across contexts. And as I say, it really, using power well means you have to be context savvy. You have to match the right power in the right context for the right reason. And so we'll get into these in the next lessons that are coming. But before that, I just want to talk about one more thing about power as we're defining it. And that is just that how, power has a real bad rap, right? There's a quote by Rosabeth Moss Cantor, professor of business at Harvard Business School, and she says, power is the last dirty word, that it's easier to talk about money and much easier to talk about sex than it is to talk about power. And, like sex and money and death, power is a taboo, and so that means that we avoid it, we don't really talk about it, or if we do talk about it, we maybe talk about it behind closed doors, or we, like with all taboos, there's a lot of myths, misunderstandings, and misinformation about power. And it's not just sort of cultural images that create this taboo, but it's also our own personal experiences with power that creates this taboo, this bad rap. And we've all been the victim of somebody's negative use of power, or maybe we've used it really negatively in the past. And so whenever that happens, whenever we have a negative experience, we bring biases, we bring judgments, we bring beliefs. And there's nothing wrong with having a bias or a judgment about anything, or but it's going to be very hard to use it well if we don't examine our own negative biases that we have about power. If you don't like power, if you have a negative judgment about it, you're actually at greater risk of using it poorly. So it's important for us to really unpack this. And so I want to give you an exercise. I want you to think about this, right, as a way to begin to befriend power, or at least to see it neutrally and not just have negative associations to it. So I'm going to walk you through a little self-reflection exercise to help you become aware of your biases and beliefs about power that might get in the way. So as you're listening, you're going to see words pop up on the screen, right? And what I want you to do is I want you to notice your automatic gut level response to the words that you see. I want you to take out a piece of paper and just write down the very first thing that comes to mind, your immediate associations to it. And don't take more than a second or two for each word. Just write down the first thing or the first couple of things that come to mind. If nothing comes to mind, skip it, don't worry about it, and go on to the next. So what did you notice? Did you have negative reactions? Did you have positive reactions? Maybe some words made you feel fear or disgust, or maybe envy or awe, criticism or jealousy. So when it comes to unpacking negative biases, I want to leave you with 3 thoughts about it. How do we change bias? The first thing to do when you have a bias is personalize it. So if you saw a word on the screen or something and you felt like revulsion or you felt criticism, the first thing to do is to personalize it. Imagine a person behind that word or in that title, right? Imagine a person in that position. And give that person human characteristics, right? So you're taking a stereotype and you're making it into something you can relate to. You're making it more human, someone who feels real to you, someone that you can actually relate to or experience. So the more you can relate, the more you can see a real human being or a real person in that role, the less susceptible you are to a stereotype or a bias. The second thing is, once you've done that, is try to take their perspective. So let's say that one of the words on the screen was boss, and you had a negative reaction to the word boss. So try to imagine being a boss. Try to take the perspective of somebody in a boss role. What might they be thinking? What might they be feeling, right? What struggles do they have? What needs do they have? What motivates them? Remember, humans are complex. We're all very complex. Stereotypes are a mental heuristic, and that means it's a shortcut. So whenever we use a stereotype, we're just taking a shortcut and we're simplifying something. But humans aren't simple by any means, right? We're very complex. So when you take someone's perspective, when you try to crawl into what someone might be thinking or feeling or what motivates them or what their needs or struggles are, you're bringing back the complexity of that human being, and you're sort of minimizing that stereotypical thoughts that you have about them. Finally, the last thing to do when you have a bias is to consider a positive example. So every time you think something negatively, if we go back to the example of boss, right, and you have like a negative thought about it, try to get an example that's the opposite. Try to think of a good boss, right? Force yourself to come up with a story, an image, or one example that counters that negative image. And that's going to help you shake free of bias. Okay, so now, one more part of this when we talk about definitions. If power comes with a taboo, right? If it comes with all these myths or misinformation or judgments that we have, that means that it's, not only do we have biases, but there's a lot of common misunderstandings about power that's floating around out there. And we hear it all the time when people talk about power. And I want to talk about 4 of them. I want to talk about 4 of the most common myths and misunderstandings that I hear when people talk about power, and how each one can lead to a poor use of power, an unintended, even abuse of power. So the first one, I hear this a lot, which is that let's do away with power, that we won't have power problems if we have a consensus-based team, if we flatten teams, if we do away with hierarchy, if we take away titles, right? We remove layers of management. Every era has had a flirtation, right, with the power-free social structures, whether it's the utopian communities of the 18th and 19th centuries, hippie communes in the 60s, to the more modern self-managing teams, holacracy, flatter teams, whatever it is today. But you'll notice it's really hard to do this. It's really hard to do away with power dynamics. And the reason is that power is not just a social dynamic. It's not just a social thing. It's a human thing. So if you get rid of titles or you get rid of management or positions, power will migrate into other dynamics. So people will stratify according to something else: seniority, popularity, loud voice, dominant behavior, gender, insider-outsider dynamics. You might get rid of the titles and management, but you're not going to get rid of power behavior. What's worse, and here's where it could have unintended consequences, is that in the absence of a designated authority, power goes underground. It's going to be much harder to know how do decisions get made, who has the power, right? Where do I go to, or how do I get promoted, or how do I get assigned to that project, right? So when the actual signs and symbols of power are missing, right, there's a greater danger that power becomes less transparent. And non-transparent power is perhaps the most dangerous type of power at all. You absolutely don't know how things happen, who has the power, and how it's going to be used. The second myth I want to talk about is that if you're emotionally intelligent, you're going to use power well. I hear this a lot. I hear people say, well, gosh, what about emotional intelligence? Isn't that going to make me be a better user of power? Isn't that all we need here? So emotional intelligence, being intelligent about your emotions and the emotions of others, is really important, and it's absolutely important for leadership. It's important for everything. It makes you a better person, right? So the more you understand your own emotions, the more you understand how to be aware of your emotions, how to, track the emotions you have and other people have, and be empathic. It makes for extraordinary leadership, and it makes for just being a great human being. Empathy, for example, classically attributed to emotional intelligence, is just good for everything, right? Having insight into your feelings and that of others. But the thing is that emotional intelligence is what's called morally neutral. And what does that mean, morally neutral? Well, it means that you can be emotionally intelligent, but how you use it and why you use it depends on your motivation. So research shows that narcissists and psychopaths and people who are scammers and con artists have high degrees of emotional intelligence, right? They know how to manipulate feelings. They know how to lie and charm people. They're very persuasive. They can get people to follow them, get people to open up their wallets, give them money, whatever. So they're using emotional intelligence. They're very charming and persuasive. So that's what's meant by morally neutral, that emotional intelligence is not enough. It depends on your motivation for why you're using it. And so understanding power is separate from just being good with emotions. To use power well, you have to be good with emotions. But being good with emotions is not enough to use power well. The third myth or misunderstanding I want to talk about is that if you're a very self-aware person, you won't misuse your power. So very similar to high emotional intelligence, a lot of people feel, well, I'm really self-aware, I'm aware of myself, and I won't misuse my power. But again, having high self-awareness is not enough to stop misusing power, and I want to explain why. First of all, remember we talked about in one of the earlier classes, we said that people are motivated to change their behavior towards you, right? So we grow in self-awareness based on the reflection of other people, right? We're not self-aware in a vacuum. We're self-aware because of how people relate to us. But if people are changing how they relate to us, it puts our self-awareness at risk. We're not really able to get an accurate reflection of ourselves, so our self-understanding suffers also. And the second thing is that when you have more power, the temptations are greater. Frequently, you also are under more pressure to perform, though not always, it depends, but you have more resources at your disposal, more privileges, more perks, more temptations for misusing power. So it's very easy to be tempted to use your power unethically or in a way that furthers your own self-interest without even knowing it. And finally, your social network has greater impact or greater influence on you than you might even think, or on your behavior rather than you might even think. So we know from research, for example, that your likelihood of smoking or the likelihood of obesity increases depending on your social network, much more than your diet or much more than any other factor. And so the same thing with power, that our social network has the power to alter our behavior. So, for example, if you're in an industry or a firm where people are behaving unethically, or they're doing things that are unethical or even illegal, the chances of you doing so increases, regardless of your own value system, regardless of what you think about yourself or what you say about yourself. Your exposure to other people's unethical behavior will increase the chances that you too will behave unethically. So for these reasons, less feedback, more isolation and temptation, more access to things and your social network, self-awareness alone just isn't that powerful to stop you from misusing power. And finally, the last myth is that a lot of people think when it comes to misusing power that it's just people with a character flaw. It's just somebody they're a psychopath, or they have a bad personality, or they're just, it's just a bad apple. You hear this all the time. Oh, it's just one bad apple, right? That's not me. But the thing is that when it comes to misuse of power, and I've seen this again and again and again, that most misuse of power is unintended. That's right. It's actually unintended. Sometimes it's done well-meaning. And one of the ways to think about it, it's like not realizing, that you can knock things over with your tail, right? You're turning around, you don't realize your tail's wagging, and you knock something over, like that image of the dog, right? So you're seeing that, it's not necessarily something that you're deliberately doing. It's not necessarily something coming from a bad character flaw, right? It's something that we do without even realizing it. And so, most of us, we're just trying to do our job. Most of us, we're trying to do something good. Most of us are trying really hard to use power well. So most of the problems related to power misuse are correctable, right? That power is a competency. So if we're misusing power and we're not aware of it, it's unintended, it means we can become conscious of it and we can learn how to use it right. So now let's take a step further and let's look at what are the psychological and social influences of power. What happens to you when you step into a role of power? Why and how does power corrupt? And then once we understand that, we'll look at the keys for power intelligence and what we can do about it.